for joining. There we go, recording in progress. So I'm Mark Fisher with Lane Office in Falkville, New York. I'm the co-chair of the Young Leader Committee. We have an awesome event for this morning. We have three people joining us: Dale Schlather, Executive Vice Chairman at Cushman and Wakefield; Mark Deieso, Senior Director at Gardiner Theobald; and then Ryan Mitchell, Director of Real Estate at General Atlantic, who's also on the Young Leader Committee. We're going to cover a few topics, and then we'll have some time for Q&A at the end of this. But I'll let Ryan get it going. And thank you, everyone, again for joining.
Thanks, Fish. And yeah, just echoing what he just said. Thank you so much for joining. We've got a really nearly 85 people on the line here, so it's a really big turnout. And I think that's an indicator that a lot of people are wanting to learn a lot more about this topic. Leases are complicated, let alone leases in New York. So we've got two more than qualified people to join us today to walk us through a few points that are often misunderstood and overlooked, to steal Malcolm Gladwell's opening line off the Revisionist History podcast. So just before we kick it off, very, very quick housekeeping. Just take a second to make sure that you're on mute. Don't assume that you are. I think often people do. So just double check that you're on mute there so we don't have any interruptions. And we're going to allow for some Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions, probably the best thing to do just to make sure that we cover off on those is put anything in the chat. And we'll allow 5-10 minutes at the end to cover off on a few of those, or at least as many as we can. So I'll just start it off today before we fire a few questions at Dale and Mark. In putting together the talk today, there is a ton of topics that we could review, some of which we have on the screen here. And you know, as we were pulling all this together and talking to Mark and Dale, we kept thinking we're probably going to have to make this into a series, because we could literally spend hours and hours and hours covering off on all of these different topics here. But unfortunately, we've only got an hour today, so we're going to cover off on 4 topics today, and they're topics that aren't the obvious ones. You know, we're not really here to talk about basic negotiation strategies for rent or what the market's doing. We really want to dig into some, as I mentioned, misunderstood or overlooked topics, which can really come back to bite you if they're not handled correctly. So I'm just going to bring up the slides for today. So those are delivery conditions, tenant improvement allowance, floor plate measurement, particularly paying attention to how that's calculated here in New York. And we're also going to talk about some other methods in other markets as well to keep your eye on. And of course, probably top of mind for everyone is flexibility and exit strategies, which we're obviously paying attention a lot to today in this market. So first of all, though, I want to ask you a question, Dale, or throw a scenario at you. Typically, when someone like myself, who's an end user, you know, is working within their company and a decision's made that we need more space, you know, we ring up our broker, yourself, and say, hey, Dale, I need some more space. We want to obviously put together some options to have a look at, to start touring. But, you know, there's more than just a broker that needs to be involved in this process, right? So can you talk a little bit about who should be forming part of, you know, the team, and who you be bringing in on the early stages of even your site search for consideration?
Right. So what's interesting, good morning, everybody. What's interesting is that usually I love to get those calls. And Ryan, anytime you're ready, I'm ready. I love to get those calls, and you do. And, you know, I think when you're working with a tenant that's, you know, 300,000, 400,000, 500,000 feet, that's one thing, because they usually have a team in place, big corporate users. You know, it tends to be the middle market, you know, a floor or 2 or 3. I've been going through a couple of those lately, and they start with the broker, and we get involved, and we're sending out proposals. We're doing we do tours, then we send proposals, and we start looking at buildings, and now we're negotiating proposals, which ultimately becomes a term sheet. And usually during that process, when we're, you know, after the tours, and it would be in a perfect world, I start pounding the table to my clients to say, listen, you need to have a project manager, an architect, a mechanical and electrical engineer on your team, starting with the project manager, because they'll help you develop that team unless you already have those relationships. Because as we go evaluate space in buildings, I am not that person. I mean, I understand, you know, the core to glass depth and I understand slab to slab heights and mullion spacing and a little bit too much about HVAC that I learned at Cornet. But at the end of the day, you're going to avoid mistakes and you're going to make better decisions by having that team together from the get-go and looking at the, you know, maybe 2 or 3 or 4 finalist buildings and evaluating them, much like they usually have their architect do a space plan. So the architect is usually on board. It's the project manager and the engineers that have become critically important, particularly as you start looking at electrical and HVAC and delivery condition issues.
So enter stage left, Mark. So you often get involved at this stage. Dale's been a great broker and advised the client to bring someone like yourself on board to start working through and looking at, you know, the design phase, but not only the design phase, we'll talk about this a little bit more today, some of the lease clauses that are negotiated as well. Before we get into that detail, can you just give a quick story or two of where this has gone really well for a client, where they have engaged someone like yourself early on and, you know, they've managed to catch out some issues that they might not have foreseen, and maybe a quick story where it's gone horribly wrong as well, both financial consequences and timeline consequences?
Yeah, morning everyone. A good process has been where the broker with the client has brought on board the architect and the MEP engineer up front. Architect from the forefront is doing test fits, and so we're looking at 4 different properties. And then with us and the engineer, we're doing due diligence of the actual buildings themselves. So we're going in there, walking the floors if possible, putting our heads in closets, and doing independent studies in that regard on the technical items of it. The engineer then comes out with a due diligence report. Architect does the same, besides just basic test fitting. And then we put budgets towards each of these. So each building you're looking at does not automatically cost the same. There's nuances depending on heating and cooling, as an example. So that's been very good when they do that up front. When they don't bring us on board early, or say it's just the architect and the engineer is brought on board after the lease is signed, there's all sorts of connotations where we've missed something as simple as, you know, how many watts per square foot demand do they need, heating and cooling, the hours of operation, supplemental cooling, not enough tonnage of supplemental based off their need. So the way you go about that is you do very detailed discovery sessions and needs assessment studies with the client, facilities and IT team. That's the best way to get around that.
Go ahead, Dale.
I just was thinking about this, and I just completed a transaction at One Vanderbilt, and this was the term sheet for that transaction. And I don't know if you can see this, but I have in the delivery conditions, it says to be reviewed by tenants, project manager, and architect, because they were not on board yet.
Well, I think that's a perfect segue into the first topic that we wanted to tackle today, which was delivery conditions. So as you mentioned, and as you astutely put in the term sheet there, Dale, you know, the end user is definitely not an expert. The broker's not an expert. Someone like Mark and you know, a company like G&T with all their consultants are the expert. So Mark, I want to ask you, when you're advising an end user, you already mentioned a couple of things that they should definitely be looking for on delivery conditions, but can you talk a little bit about, you know, what is typical for to be included in the base build? What should be handled by the landlord, and what are some things that the tenant may handle that they should be paying very careful attention to, you know, as it relates to the landlord handing over the space?
I think it's important to know, depending if it's a new tower going up, call it Hudson Yards or World Trade or Manhattan West, versus an existing building, Fifth Avenue Park, Madison, whatever, the delivery conditions will be completely different. They're typically much more longer and extensive for a new building, and you have pre and post delivery conditions. You know, hitting some of the big ones. The big one is bathrooms. So is the landlord delivering the bathrooms, or is Dale going to try and negotiate more TI where we would build out the bathrooms as part of our fit out? I'm a proponent of that because we get to own our own destiny as long as we get good money for it. Floor levelness is a big one, floor flatness. New buildings are traditionally horrible. I've been here probably 16 years, and my first new building experience was the New York Times Tower. We actually rejected floors at delivery because they were sloping so badly going up from the core out to the facade. But in those types of buildings, you try and put in metrics like a 1/4 inch in a 10-foot grid, take it from a zero tolerance, call it the elevator saddle with no more than 2 inches from facades on the east facade to the west, versus some of the existing buildings. Some of those landlords, and they're built better, will say, you know what, I'm not giving you any of that. You basically, I'm giving it to you clean, no obstructions, core drills are filled, and it's good enough to receive carpet. That's the easy one. Column treatment is something that's always traditionally was, we would always ask for spray fireproofed and enclosed with sheetrock. Now, without even a design, we don't know if the client's going for an industrial look. It may be intumescent paint. So then we're spending money ripping apart what we had the landlord deliver. So that's something to be cognizant of. Convectors, the delivery condition of a convector itself is primed, all dents taken out, ready to receive paint from the tenant side, replace the grills, new Danfoss valves, make sure it's functional and operational. Try and get a written report from the base building upon delivery from their HVAC guy. Sprinklers left in place versus a temp loop is a big one, depending again on the age of the building. Talking about some of the older ones. I'm dealing with a lease now downtown where it's an old building. The landlord refuses to remove the sprinklers and give us a temp loop. So I'm like, okay, well, that means you've got to take out, you have to keep your existing sprinklers, turn all the heads upright and deliver it. And he's trying to figure out the dollar. So he gave up and said, you know what, I'll give you your damn temp loop.
And Mark, what about just on touching on inheriting old buildings or working with an old building? What about in New York? Can you talk to about ADA compliance? You know, what if you're taking over a lease? Sorry, not taking over a lease, but going into a building where that just simply doesn't exist. Would you typically advise the client to have the landlord prep the building so it's ADA compliant? Is it the other way around? What do you typically see?
It depends on the uniqueness of the building. Some of the core bathrooms, if to go ADA, you're basically losing a stall or a wet point. So a lot of clients just choose to take as is with the existing number of toilets or wet points, urinals, whatever, in that core bathroom and build call it an ADA compliant or unisex, whatever you call it, gender neutral bathroom in their demise outside of the core.
Sure.
It really is building specific, I think.
Hey, Mark, let me, since I'm negotiating this in like 3 circumstances right now, what would you recommend? The problem is the floor areas are not the same, right? Some floors are 25,000, some are 30, some are 35. How many dollars per square foot per rentable would you suggest you need for bathrooms?
Typically these days, if we can get 15 to 20 is excellent.
And the landlords want to give 10 and they say that's enough.
That's exactly right. So we typically break it out on the side and we work with you on the side, right? As part of our team and say, look, this is what it's going to cost to build it out. And we typically do it per wet point. We can, depending on the information, we'll budget it out very clean. So I will prove to you it's going to cost you $150,000 or $200,000 to build out a men's and the same for a women's. Divide that and you get a cost per square foot, depending on the size of the floor plate, to your point. Then at some point, you've got enough ammunition now where it becomes a business decision, right? In your order of things you want to negotiate, you know what it's going to cost a tenant to build this thing. So it becomes part of the bigger picture, not just on bathrooms. But we're seeing these days some Class A existing buildings. We have recently been negotiating 15, some of the newer buildings up to 20, because the standard finishes are much better in general.
Dale, what else would you be having your clients pay a lot of attention to for delivery conditions?
So depending on where you are, one of the things that I just went through with this transaction at One Vanderbilt, the space was adjacent to a mechanical floor. And so sound became a big issue in terms, right, having acoustics people. And Mark, I imagine you bring them on board. I don't know if that's typical unless there's an extraordinary situation like that. Some mechanical floors face on the floor though.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I actually talked to an acoustician or two. We don't bring them on board formally, but we pick their brain off record, knowing that they're going to be bidding the project. So they're happy to give it. And a lot of the top 2 or 3 acousticians in town know the buildings already. Hold on you.
Another thing that comes up is allowing the landlord to do some work, particularly if they're doing the bathrooms, but it could be other things as well. While at the same time that we're doing our tenant improvements. And I imagine, Mark, we haven't talked about this, but I imagine that creates some obstacles for you and what we put in the lease to protect the tenant from the landlord taking over and getting in the way and obstructing our construction.
A bad example I had on one of the new towers a while ago was what we could not work within 5 feet of the core while they were doing the bathrooms. So that was like really dumb. And what happened there, we had the smart brokers and lawyers involved during the lease, and they came up with this fantastic plan, which was like silly. Recent experiences where we have a partnering agreement, we're going to get it done together, and we typically take care of it on site. So if I've got Turner Core and Shell, and I've got one of the typical interiors boys that we represent on site working together, and it gets done. The key there is to have certain components. You must have a finished date for bathrooms and an outside date for completion, because we can't complete our work until they're 100% out of there. And with commissioning, air handling units is another big one as well.
Another unusual one that I've come up with in the last couple of years, particularly at One Vanderbilt, but also at Hudson Yards, is removal of the hoist. And particularly at One Vanderbilt, they had a huge area that basically the floor was sheetrocked off where the hoist enclosure was, and they had to take that from the top of the building down, and it took months for them to remove the hoist, and then they had to repair that area. So if you were doing tenant improvements in that area, you couldn't do it until they removed that enclosure and the hoist was gone, and they had to put the windows in, right?
Yeah, the curtain wall back up. So hoist comes down, curtain wall goes back up the other way. We have different. It's funny. It depends on the the design of the curtain wall and how that can work. How far you can bring the tenant interiors to the facade while you've still got a hoist impact area. Then once the hoist is down, how can we work? On Manhattan West, some of the other buildings have been very stringent in giving you a hoist impact area. And we've had many clients in the past, particularly law firms, where we say, you know what, they're moving in. The building's still, they've got their TCO, but they haven't finished yet. So they will live with, 2 attorney officers not functioning for another 6 months. We're currently working at the Spiral where we're representing the tenants under construction now. And that helps us because we get to have a much more leeway on the hoist usage compared to working with 10 other interiors contractors for other clients during construction. And the way that project is designed from a curtain wall perspective, it allows us basically to build almost up to the facade. It's almost like a fake wall like you do when you do a hotel renovation. So the comeback work after move-in is very non-intrusive to the tenant while they're occupying the space. It's a huge delivery condition discussion, the hoist. The funny thing is, we want it down as fast as possible, but I don't want it down because I want to bring my furniture up through the hoist because that's when I can get maximum vertical transportation. So you're playing this.
Yeah,
fair enough.
And to finish, the biggest issue I see is the floor leveling seems to be the biggest fight in New York. The newer buildings tend to be more open to it. Older buildings, it's a big fight. They don't want it leveling, and that can be very, I defer to Mark, but I think it's pretty expensive. And you got to be careful. You don't want to have, if you're not level, then all of a sudden you've got a wall and you've got a gap and you've got to fill that in. It's a real problem, right, Mark?
It's hard, and because first of all, we don't have a design.
It's not only expensive, it takes a lot of time out of your schedule. And if you're using demountable partitions, which many more tenants are using these days, it becomes a nightmare. Yes.
I think what's important to know is that that's the point when we're negotiating this, depending on the building, we don't really have a design. We might have a test fit. So at least we know, is it an open area plan? Do we have a lot of perimeter offices? That's where the demountables come into discussion. Is it a central core? Is it a side core? That we're there. If it's a side core, you can zone it. So I don't need to level the entire floor off a zero benchmark off the elevator saddle. It's a bit easier. To Dale's point, and we know all the heads of construction, a lot of these landlords, right? The existing buildings, we know what we get away with. And then again, becomes a business discussion and we manage it accordingly. The newer buildings got to have a very specific metric that I mentioned earlier. I had a problem once at a building, won't name buildings, where they had to level in some areas and chip in others. And we ultimately ended up chipping out what they put in and filled in other areas because our floor transitions, the floors finishes themselves were not designed. So it was
I think this actually brings us nicely onto the next topic somewhat, which is tenant improvement allowance. So we just talked about we touched a little bit on kind of what state of the space you're going to be inheriting it, what responsibilities you're going to be taking on in terms of building out the space. But I guess looking a little bit more long term, perhaps post construction. Dale, can you touch a little bit about or on use it or lose it or pass through abilities when it comes to your TI? Say after you built out the space, you got some dollars left over. What do you want to be thinking about in that regard when you're looking at your term sheet and the lease?
Yeah, so this is my pound the table issue because landlords in New York always want to give you 2 years to spend your TI allowance, or 3 years or something like that. And I'm always like, well, wait a second, we're going to pay rent for 15 years or 10 years. So wait, so if we're paying you rent, then, and the deal that we cut was based on a $125 foot tenant improvement allowance, and after 2 years, something happens and we didn't build out our space, you're taking that away? So are you reducing our rent? I mean, and this ends up being a huge fight. And for me, I would tell my clients, you don't go forward. Hard stop. Whenever you want to use that tenant improvement allowance. Now, the landlord wants you to put the money in the space. That's what they're going to say. And that's fair. They do. But my argument would be, the later they put it in the, you know, they use the TI allowance and build out the space, the newer the tenant improvements are going to be if you ever get the space back. And the thing is, situations change, and I have seen it, and I have seen clients, not leases I negotiated, but where I came in after the fact, that lost millions of dollars in TI allowance because they didn't pay attention. And what happened was, they had negotiated it, and then they get bought by another company. The other company has an office. They didn't pay it. This is years ago. You know, it's a little less frequent now that this would happen because of the lease admin that everybody has. But somebody didn't pay attention to the lease, and the next thing you know, they lost their TI allowance for a couple of $1 million. And the other one is passing through, being able to pass through a tenant improvement allowance to subtenants. Why not?
What's the argument that landlords usually kick over to you in that regard? You know, we want to give it to you, and you know, we want you to spend the money, but realistically, if you're passing it on to someone, it's going to be, or should be spent at some point.
You know, I've never lost the point, but I did a transaction where I started working with Capital One at 90 Park, and there was a tenant in their space. It was actually a subtenant, not of them, but they had a must-take on the 5th floor. First New York Securities was on the 5th floor, and Cap had a must-take. They had bought North Fork Bank, and they had inherited that lease. And that lease with a must-take did not allow them to sublease to the tenant that was occupying the space. And in the end, we moved them to 299 Park, and we were going to sublet all their space, and Vornado would not allow us to do it. In the end, we worked it out. It was a long story how, I don't want to get into it, but we were able to work it out, mainly because they needed the space for PricewaterhouseCoopers. So we had leverage, but it happens. And it's just a hard stop, because when you sign a lease, it takes time for you to finish your plan, start your construction in most cases, and the world can change. You know, look at COVID. But it can change for other reasons. It can change because of the financial crisis. It can change because somebody bought your company. It could be you bought another company, and all of a sudden you don't need the space. And what happens is, when all that happens, everything goes on pause and nobody's paying attention. And then all of a sudden you read this clause in the lease that says you have to use the TI allowance or you can't pass it through. And then what? You're going to build out the space yourself and then sublet it? That doesn't make any sense. So my advice to everybody is, if you're confronted with this issue, you never, ever, ever accept it. You should be able to use that TI allowance anytime during the lease, and you should always be able to pass it through to subtenants. And to answer your question directly, the reason the landlords don't want you to do it is because they don't want to pay the TI allowance, and they're trying to find money, number one. And number two, they'll use the argument that we're doing the deal with you, we're not doing the deal with subtenant. And it's like, but that you know, that doesn't, we have the right to sublease. So, and our financial arrangement is rent TIs, free rent. We get the free rent and we get our TIs, and we pay you rent over the term. Hard stop, end of discussion.
And what about, and I think this would be good to bring Mark in on this question as well. What about some instances where the landlords are proposing that the TI is spent or not spent on certain items? I'm thinking, for example, you know, perhaps not covering off soft costs, for example, or to get a little bit more detailed, Mark, you know, maybe when it's being negotiated, the freight elevator usage isn't thought of as well, and you have to allocate your TI or spend it on items that you might not want to because you haven't thought about what to negotiate into the lease in that regard. So can you talk a little bit more about that? And Dale, feel free to hit off on a couple of other things that come to mind.
Yeah, on the elevators and the hoists, again, if we're talking to an existing building, you're basically getting 3 hours, X number of free hours to use during construction and move-in. If you're lucky, it's going to pay for a fifth of it. So it's all about negotiating. The more you can get, the better.
What would you advise? I mean, I know that the scales of projects obviously vary massively, but is there some sort of metric that you would say, hey,
Look, I'm doing
you need a minimum
150,000 square foot law firm now. We went in with 300 hours, and the response came in yesterday, and we counted at 160. So Dale and his counterpart are going to play the game for the next month, figuring it out, and it's going to become something. So okay, we'll get to this, knowing that you're not going to get the whole job built based off 3 hours off an elevator. Hoist is really different going into a new building because hoist charges, you got local 14 vertical transportation operators involved, right, until they get their TCO at least. And they typically suck you dry on also including host of accoutrements that go with using the hoist, your loading dock, security, master mechanic. One of the new buildings, they were the first tenant in, and their hourly rate for the hoist was $7.50 an hour. Of course, we all fell off our chair, right? So that's one comment, and we could talk about that one for a while. Back to your other point about for TI, typically furniture is not allowed. It's all hard construction, and you make 10, 15, 20% for soft costs. So what we try and do is try and get as much money up front as we can for all the soft costs. Then once we start construction, we'll try and get the bulk of that through to like 90% by the time we're finished and ready to move in. So the balance of the 10% is for closing out permits, FD&Y and whatnot.
Dale, can you talk a little bit about the payment schedule of TI that you should be trying to think about? Monthly payments, is it sort of amortized other ways? What would you be advising your clients?
Well, I just wanted to address a couple of other things, because you need to remember, as you go along in the process, the tenant's negotiation, their leverage decreases. So as soon as you have a signed term sheet, you're right, and you go to lease, your leverage decreases because you've given away the other spaces that you're looking at. You may hold them in your hip pocket, right? So there are things that you need to deal with related to TIs and the build out, and you need to deal with it in the term sheet. And by the way, your law firm better get 300 or 500 hours, Mark, because that 160 is ridiculous.
Oh, we haven't responded yet. I agree.
Yeah, but anyway, you have landlord supervision fees, and whether or not they should get any supervision fees, the answer is no. On initial tenant improvements, they should get none. You probably have to pay for some, their costs if they have to hire mechanical engineers, and you have to use their mechanical engineer. And this goes back to the first thing we talked about, having the PM team and the architect on board. They want, they give you a list of vendors that you can use, subcontractors. And I want Mark to tell me who are, if we know who, and we may not know, by the way, but he may know the 3 or 4 that he wants to use in various categories. And let's get that approved before the term sheet's done.
Yeah,
right. And the elevator time obviously is a big issue. On the payment of the TIs, we usually, there's too much to talk about in this for this session, because there's a lot of counting issues that get into it. Now the landlords want to own the TIs and depreciate them. Some do, some don't. Some tenants do, some tenants don't.
Right.
But obviously I'm always trying to get the first dollars in are paid for by the landlord. They want to do it pari passu. So, equally, you have a budget, they give you 125, your total cost is 250, 50 cents each. And then they want you to withhold a certain amount until they get everything signed off at the end of the project. They get all their, what's the word, Mark, that I'm looking for, the sign offs at the end.
But yeah, close out with the permits and etc. DAB, FD&Y.
So, right, lien waivers and all of that sort of stuff. So they hold usually 10%. They'll ask for, they'll try to get more, but 10% is usually it. So usually it's pay as you go and on a pro rata basis, and then you negotiate some sort of, a monthly or so. Some of my clients, the bigger clients, they don't really care. I mean, They kind of finish the thing and then they send a bill and they get reimbursed for the whole thing. And because the interest rates are pretty low and they got a lot of cash, and it's not a big deal one way or the other. They just want to make sure they're reimbursed. And by the way, depending on the landlord, you want to get the right to offset in the event that something happens with the landlord and they default or they're a bad landlord. You want to make sure to get a right of offset, meaning if they don't pay the TI allowance within a certain time, then you get to take that amount with interest, and you that becomes rent abatement that gets added on at the end of your free rent period.
Absolutely. All right, I think that's a really good overview of delivery conditions and TI. I'd like to hit on a topic that always confuses a lot of people, which is how to measure floor plates, usable areas, rentable areas, particularly in New York, because of course, being New York, we have to do things a lot differently to other markets. So Dale, I'd love for you to talk through how we go from, in New York, from calculating rentable and arriving at a number that is usable, and how a loss factor is calculated, what the standards are that we usually abide by, and maybe hit a little bit on some other methods that we're seeing in other markets and what's changing as well. I'm going to bring up that slide that you sent through to me so you can talk through this. And
so I'd probably spend more time explaining this to my clients, particularly from out of town, than any other issue. And by the way, they never understand it. So I tried to, put something out here that will help everybody to explain it. This is a bit simplified.
Oops, sorry.
Oh, okay. So this is a bit simplified, but there are two kinds of methods of measurement. One is BOMA, Building Office, what is it? Building Owners Management Association, I think it is, building owner, and which is everything outside of New York. And then there's REBNY, Real Estate Board of New York. Now, most people don't know REBNY, they actually only define the usable square footage of REBNY. And BOMA and REBNY are pretty much the same on usable. It's changed a little now, but you can see it on the left-hand side. That area in blue, which includes the blue inside the core. And basically the yellow is excluded from that, which are, the vertical penetrations. The big difference between BOMA and REBNY is that REBNY, you can measure to the outside portion of the building. So to put that in perspective, if you're at like Rock Center or something, and you've got a column that protrudes, this far outside the building, let's call it a foot, but the floor plate is, 400, 500 feet long. So you add 400 or 500 usable feet per floor. It's a big difference. And so you're automatically, you have more square footage because of that. Then in BOMA, they just allocate some common area things. And actually in preparing for this, I didn't know this, but in 2017, BOMA now allows you to allocate the common area like outdoor spaces, or if you have a if you have a terrace, an outdoor terrace or a rooftop that's yours, that is now usable area for tenants, which, by the way, under REBNY, it's the first time I've ever seen REBNY less aggressive than BOMA, but they don't do that in New York. You don't pay for terraces in New York, not directly anyway. You pay higher rent, but you don't pay the square footage. So then what BOMA does, they just allocate that. And the typical loss factors for BOMA tend to be, now they're like, 15 to 18%, something like that. It used to be 12 to 15% back when I started. REBNY, however, there's no loss factor acquired. Basically, it's a market-driven loss factor. When I started working in New York in 1995, I was representing ICM at 40 West 57th Street. They had 3 floors. Those 3 floors were 18,000 feet rentable square foot, 3 floors. So 54,000. The loss factor was 18%, which is what it was way, way, way back when, because it was like BOMA. The loss factor went to 23%, and they remeasured the floors, and presto changeo, those 3 floors that were 54,000 feet became 72,000 feet. So they added a floor, right? Every 3 floors, they added a floor. And so now that loss factor has been pretty much, it's 27%, but buildings like One Vanderbilt are at 29%, 425 Park is at 29%. The newer buildings are trying to push it. And that has a dramatic effect on what the total square footage is of the space in the building. So if you look at this chart, and that's where I say it's like the usable area plus the core equals the gross area, right? That's, well, I'm looking actually to the left right now where the red is. And then you've heard the definition of curb to curb measurement. That's because the loss factor of 27% causes the actual area to exceed the gross area of the floor. That's New York. And that's that red area. So it actually, if you look at it, it's outside. So now if we look at the chart and we assume that, you know, in most cities, you've got a floor plate that has 20,000 feet. And as I said before, with an extra, little bit of extra from REBNY, you get 20,500. So you got 500 more usable feet. And you can see the loss factors at 15 and 27. You end up with 23.5 versus 28,082, a difference of 4,553 rentable square feet. And if the rent per square foot is 75, and I put that in as the gross, but let's pretend that that's a net rent, right? So there's 25 of expenses or something. So it could be 100, but because we're going to calculate the net operating income and the value, we're assuming that's a net rent. So the difference is zero. The rent is the same, BOMA versus REBNY, but the total rent you get is $341,459 on that floor more per year because of the REBNY measurement. And you got 50 floors, there's no difference. The total rent for the building, because you remeasured it at the 27% loss, you make $17 million a year more rent. And then if you cap that at 5, which actually is a pretty high cap rate in New York for a first-class building in New York, you just added $341 million of value to that building, doing nothing except you're measuring it per REBNY instead of that. So that's the reason that the landlords do it. And they initially did it because they were trying to keep the face rate under $100 a foot. So they kept making it bigger because that was a psychological barrier. Now the psychological barrier is 200 a foot, but so it's changed. But anyway, that's what it's all about. And but the main issue here, other than understanding it, is you need to hire Mark and his team and the architect and measure the floors, because the landlords cheat. I don't know how else to say it. I don't know if cheat is the right word, but they all measure it a little differently. I've never came to 100% agreement. You're just going to make sure some of them are more aggressive than others. So anytime you would do a deal, whether it's 10,000 feet, and we'll talk first in a second about multi-tenant floors, but whether it's 10,000 feet or 10 million feet, you measure the space and make sure it's critically important, because you may not be able to change the loss factor. But if they've measured it wrong, in your opinion, and you can negotiate that, you may get them to reduce the rent. You won't get them to reduce the square.
Well, this is what we were talking about before we jumped on the call. It's really your only point of negotiation here. You can't really negotiate the loss factor, but you can make sure that the area has been measured correctly, and then it'll recalculate from there, hopefully in your favor.
And I have worked on a number of transactions where the measurement was way off, and either we walked away or we were successful in renegotiating the rent to reflect the proper number. And then you got to make a note in the file, hey, they cheat, the square footage isn't right, so make sure you remember that when you renew.
Mark, anything to add to that?
Yeah, just to be clear, make it, and that was 100% as usual, but like the architect cannot physically, it's impossible to measure the RSF. The architect must measure the USF as clearly defined per REBNY, Real Estate Board of New York.
Right, and that requires sometimes explaining that to the architects, because they're so frequently, they just do regular usable, not how meaning usable in the sense of space that you actually use, right?
And it's very important for us, Ryan, because at a concept cost planning mode, where we're putting budgets together for 4 or 5 different buildings, the architect will tell us what we measure per plannable or carpetable square footage.
Yep.
The architect will help us to make sure we align within a foot or two on the usable square foot. So we use that for budget purposes, always reporting up to the summary in rentable.
Absolutely. All right, guys. Well, we've got 15 minutes left, and I'd love to touch on one more topic, which a lot of people are thinking about at the moment, which is flexibility and exit strategies, and then we'll have a bit of time for some Q&A at the end. So, Dale, let me throw this to you. So, can you touch on some some areas or some nuances that should be, I guess, closely watched when it comes to subleasing and assignment clauses,
Yeah.
Particularly around pass-through and sublessor rights.
So, obviously subleasing is the main exit strategy, but you can negotiate termination rights in the leases as well. Desk sharing arrangements now have become very popular, 10 to 20% of your space that you can use. It's, sometimes it's just to have your consultants come in and use the space. Usually you can get away with that anyway, but you can also rent desks to people, but usually it's limited to, 10 to 15 is pretty typical. I've seen as high as 20. But mostly it's sublease and assignment. So on the sublease side, there are a few things to watch for. Probably, obviously who you're allowed to sublease to and from is probably my biggest issue. And in New York, in addition to the fact, and there's recapture rights, and recapture rights don't concern me really that much because it's very rare that you make a profit on a sublease. So if a landlord recaptures space and particularly if they terminate the lease or at least the lease for that part of it, because you're doing it for the whole term, that's a good thing. You're off the hook, you write it off, you're done. When you're subleasing, obviously now you've got credit risk, so that's probably not as good. Most people freak out about recapture, but like I said, it doesn't bother me as much. But buildings in New York almost always will not allow you to sublease to or from other tenants in the building. And when you put space on the market to sublease, the highest probability of the tenant that's going to take that space is someone in the building, particularly if there's no space available in the building. But somebody that's looking to grow. And then what happens is the landlord says, no, you don't have the right to do it. And then they say, depending on the landlord, good landlords are like, no problem, you can do it. Bad landlords will be like, yeah, give me $1 million and you can do it. Or give me more of the profit share. And so you got to make sure that that issue is excluded. And by the way, you want to be able to sublease from, and I put that in the leases too, from other tenants in the building. And it's always if the landlord does not have comparable, and comparable means, locationally, size, all kinds of things, space available, because they don't want to compete with their tenants. And I understand that, that's fair. But if they don't have space, let us go get it from someone else and run our business, because that's really what it's about. We're in the real estate business, but not really, right? And so that's a big issue. Then you want to make sure that you in your lease as the tenant, that you have the right to sublease to tenants and give them a recognition agreement. This is particularly true. And by the way, everyone's credit is good till it's not. So Lehman Brothers and Bear Stearns had great credit till they didn't. And so you should put it in because things change over 15 years.
Can you very quickly define what a recognition agreement is, just for folks that might not know?
So some people call it a non-disturbance agreement as well, which is, non-disturbance usually get from the lender, right? Because if the landlord were to default or go bankrupt or whatever, and the building gets foreclosed upon, and now the lender owns the building, you want to make sure that your lease is not wiped out, because technically it's at a lower level than the mortgage, and technically all the liens below that get wiped out in a foreclosure action. Yep. So since you just spent $350 a foot with Mark as your project manager on your space, you don't want to lose that money. And now they come to you, the lender comes to you, and you don't have the right to stay. And they say, okay, now the rent's 100 a foot, it was 75, but so you want to make sure up front that lender, this is the non-disturbance agreement, says, okay, in the event that there's a landlord default and a foreclosure, we'll recognize you as a direct tenant to the new owner, meaning the lender.
Yep. Okay.
So that SNDA. So now when you're subletting, it's the same thing. The recognition agreement is like a non-disturbance in the same format, except now the landlord is like the lender in that equation. So if the tenant, for example, I represented Avon at 777, they had 350,000 feet that we sublet. And fortunately in that lease, and Avon at that time, their credit was actually not great, but we had in the lease the right that we would get the landlord to recognize any sublease we did, as long as we started from the lowest floor and the highest floor, and we went up and down so that we weren't leaving, you know, a bunch of floors in the middle exposed. We didn't do one in the middle. But if, as long as we did that, then they would recognize that subtenant as a direct tenant in the event that Avon were to go upside down and default on the lease. And that's critically important to, you know, HSS took 4 floors. That was critically important to them because they were going to spend money on the space too. And right. So getting that recognition in the lease, what that does is, now if I'm representing some tenant and I'm going in to sublet from some other tenant that maybe has, you know, credit that's shaky or not, doesn't really matter. We want to make sure that if there's a problem, we're not going to get kicked out, particularly if we're going to spend a bunch of money on the space.
And Mark,
so that's a better thing to do.
Sorry, Dale. Mark, when you're advising your clients sort of around thinking about future-proofing the space, it's probably maybe less of a lease issue, but more of a design issue, if you want to call it that. What would you be telling your clients in terms of thinking, okay, well, hey, if you want to have multiple uses for the space or sublease parts off in the future, think about X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, if you want to shed space, let's call it for sublet or other. The big one is making sure you're easily able to bifurcate the shaft space, your IT connectivity. So you're completely kept intact in your contiguous floors, and then they can easily split away. Feature stairs, if you've got interconnecting stairs between floors, there's restoration there, right? Someone's gonna have to fill in the floor and take out the stair. A good example, you've got a law firm, 10 floors, be cognizant where you plan your amenity floor, conference and amenities, in the middle of the stack, or if you want to shed space, do it at the bottom or at the top, so you know where you can shed if you have to. It's much easier to shed a practice floor than an amenity floor. Yeah, they're 3 good examples right there.
Okay, excellent.
Right. One other thing that I want to point out on is timing and how that's all done up front, because you want to make sure, you know, does the landlord has the right of recapture, which I mentioned. That's fine. I don't have a problem with that. What I have a problem with is when they recapture. So what you don't want to do is, in a perfect world, what you want to, you know, the perfect world is when you decide to put the space on the market for sublease, you go to the landlord with a notice that says, we're going to put it on the market for the remainder of the term at a certain rent. And then they have 30 days or whatever, it could be 45. You're not in a big hurry then to recapture if they need it for another tenant in the building. That's great. And then if they recapture, great, we're done. If you can't get that, then when you have a term sheet done with a subtenant, you go to that subtenant. I'm sorry, you go to the landlord with the term sheet, and then they have a period of time to recapture. So that you don't have to go, because I see it in a lot of leases, you actually have to go negotiate the lease. So you're going to spend money on law firms and everything else. And if you're the subtenant in that circumstance, when I'm representing the subtenant, I want to ask the question, when does the landlord have the right to recapture? Because I don't want to go through the process and then find out, right? And now I'm screwed. I just 90 days and now we got to get in space and we don't have time. So
that's a serious impediment on the timeline and an expense for sure. Okay, we've got 7 minutes left. Let's check out a couple of questions that we've got in the chat for Q&A. So feel free to send in a few of those, guys. Hold on 1 second. Okay. Mark, I think this will be a good one for you. How are you advising clients releases as the reporting timelines for local laws 97 approach?
Bringing on a decent engineer to renegotiate on our behalf. Seriously, that is such a topic now. I've seen at least 2 leases currently working on where it's getting very complicated, and our engineer is negotiating. It's all about what do we split the cost difference to make sure our tenant doesn't pick up costs that they have nothing to do because of the not able to receive the reduction as required for 97. It's honestly, as a PM, I'm not an engineer. I know enough about it to be dangerous, not enough to bring on my client. This reports back to bring on a decent engineer up front. Local law 97.
Okay. Dale, anything to add to that?
no. Local law 97, that I call Mark.
And you know what? I tell you, we're doing 2 leases now, same square footage for they're both law firms going into different buildings. One's a Terrace building, one's a Brookfield building, and we're negotiating the same stuff on our end with the same engineer on both, and the landlords are coming at it completely different ways from their end. So it's out there. Real quick, Larry made a great comment. Always negotiate the ability to add contracts to the approved list. Absolutely, do that up front. All the big boys in town have their approved lists, and you always add that language because they're always fine. Say, look, we'll deal with it off after lease later when it's us just technical guys on the side of the fence. Add subcontractors and add any specialty disciplines. Make sure you can have diversity in expediters. As much as we love every single expediting company in town, you want to at least have 2 or 3, but landlords are pushing for you to always use theirs these days. So you've got to be cognizant of that, along with structural engineers.
Okay. Dale, I think this is going for you. Are landlords offering incentives and leases since COVID to attract tenants? Are landlord turnkey build-outs becoming more popular in your experience? Are tenants just looking? Tenants looking for this? Are tenants looking for this over just TI dollars, or can they use themselves?
So I'll take the second part first. You do see some, pre-builts are kind of a big thing right now. You don't see a lot of, on smaller transactions, you'll see landlord build outs. Again, we could spend a whole day on this subject because understanding the accounting implications of who builds out space and how that works, and what usually I have is a client, I've done it a couple of times, but it's very hard to do, where they don't want to have to book a lease until like the next year for some reason. They don't want to have duplicate rent because they're in 2 locations. And so they have the landlord build out the space so that they're not taking possession, which is what triggers the accounting. It's very hard to do because you lose control, and the auditors are looking over everything. So it's very hard. But for smaller tenants, yeah, you're starting to see more, and you see landlords and, for example, at One Vanderbilt, they're building on the 54th floor, they're building 4, super high end, $200 a foot, $200 a foot rent, 10,000 square foot or a little less, 8,000 square foot suites. And you are seeing more than that, around, because, but the sublease market is so big right now. Maybe you're not, you'll probably see a little less of that because you're competing with that market where space is already built out. But because building out space has gotten very expensive, and, Mark can speak to this better than me, but it's, gone. I'm seeing budgets now like that are kind of blowing my mind. I thought, it was 300 a foot. Now I'm seeing 400 a foot in certain circumstances for, top trophy space. Wow. And so it's a big issue. On the issue about COVID, that was a big conversation last year. You're seeing a little less of it now. Not really COVID protection. It's more of a retail thing. Certainly on retail leases or anything like that, you get a lot more protection. What I'm seeing is that if, during your construction of tenant improvements, there's a problem with COVID and they have to shut down construction, then you get a day for day abatement until you can pick it up again. You're not really this is in the Class A, kind of buildings. You're not seeing a lot more than that now. I think people are kind of over that. It was a big conversation a year ago, but it's moved away. But they will protect you on the construction. But once you're in the space, then it's on your nickel, your risk, your insurance, if you can insure it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's, a big reason why that got nowhere, as in, being able to exit leases or whatever, because of COVID or abatements, or when the lockouts, was just what effect that would have on the mortgagees, mortgagors at the end of the day, I should say. So that wasn't going to fly to start with, and it just never took off, didn't it?
No.
Yeah.
And, moved on.
Fingers crossed. Well, look, we've only got a couple of minutes left, and I just wanted to take a minute to thank you both for your time today. I think hopefully people found this really, really interesting, and as you can all tell, hopefully, there's just so much more to unpack when it comes to negotiating leases, especially in New York. They're massive documents, many different things that you have to navigate. So I think there's more than enough content to do around 2. So stay tuned for that. We'd love to see people come again and learn a little bit more. But thank you so much, Dale. Thank you so much, Mark, for your time today. And we really appreciate it, and hope everyone got a lot out of the call today.
Most welcome. Thank you.
A lot of fun.
Yeah, indeed. Thanks very much, everyone. Have a great day.
Event tonight now.
Yeah.
All right. Have a good day.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.